Michigan at Risk is made possible in part by a grant from the Michigan Association of Public Broadcasters Statewide Program Fund.
I want to talk about what I feel the union has given me. When I first started at L3 about 6 years ago, I had never been anywhere near a union, never had any union background at all, wasn't familiar with the ins and outs of how a union worked or anything.
Unionism is still strong in the sense of the word. There are changes that are challenging the unions right now, and it's kind of a frightening time.
I think a lot of us take for granted what we have, and we don't know exactly, how we got it and why it is so significant in our lives.
We're going backwards. We're going to a time where people don't care about unions because they don't understand what union is.
Unfortunately, it's taking a beating right now from the corporate world, corporate America, on the news, in the press, in the community. People don't realize that it was the unions that created and gave us the middle class.
Unions today are I think, in early stage of being as flummoxed about what to do to new workers entering the workforce, some of whom don't speak English, as much as they were in the past. To the degree they solve that problem, they'll reinvent themselves, or they'll grow, or new organizations will be created. To the degree they don't, they'll be marginalized.
No contract, no work.
These are tough times for labor. In 2 decades, America's once mighty unionized workforce has shrunk as plants closed or moved abroad. Union jobs, once thought to be secure, are routinely eliminated or sent to non-union shops. Since the 1980s, membership has declined. The United Auto Workers have seen their numbers drop from a high of around 1.6 million to less than 700,000 today. Under an unrelenting onslaught, mostly from business and the political right, union workers have been labeled as everything from obstacles to profit to lazy and overpaid.
Let your presence be known, President, Mr. President.
Kinder assessments suggest that unions have lost touch with their members and their purpose. This summer, labor had little to cheer about when the UAW headed into the new contract talks with the automakers. The most immediate issue facing them was health care and the so-called legacy costs for pensions and benefits of a massive retired workforce. The traditional leading items of pay and job security were barely mentioned. Yet, despite 25 years of the doom, gloom, and tough times, there is a bright spot on labor's horizon. Some unions, those not in the manufacturing area, have been reshaping what they do with a measure of success. Membership is steady and even increasing, and the 2008 presidential election looks to be the brightest for labor in decades. Thanks largely to the waning popularity of George W. Bush and the Republicans, labor and the Democrats have a newfound voice, and people seem to be listening. For the first time in many election cycles, every one of the Democratic presidential candidates supports labor's core issues: health care that covers all Americans, union members or not, and a bill that makes it easier to unionize workers.
I believe in an America where if you have to go out on strike, no scab can walk through that picket line and take your job away from you. That's what kind of America I believe in.
But even if labor rides to victory with a new president championing its issues, will that be enough to put unions back on the road to power? Can labor's fortunes be reversed? And why did this once powerful movement that was so central to American life fall so far?
It used to be that in the 50s, people were very active, in the 60s even more active, because they had a cause. But workers, they don't understand what took place, or they don't care. And we've got to get back to that because we're losing numbers.
Labor unions have always found their footing when workers banded together because of poor pay or dangerous working conditions. It was no different in Michigan. By the mid-1800s, Detroit was already on its way to becoming the most prominent city west of New York and east of Chicago. What had begun as a sleepy outpost of trappers and fur traders soon grew into a transit point for Michigan's ample lumber, ore, and copper, all of which moved in and out of Detroit over newly built railroads and Great Lakes ships. In the pre-factory era of the 1800s, most of the well-paying jobs in Michigan were done by skilled workers, wherever new cities and towns were setting down roots: Grand Rapids, Muskegon, Bay City, and Marquette. They worked in lumber companies and small shops as cabinet makers, shoemakers, cigar makers, and tailors, and most moved from one job to the next carrying the specialized tools of their trade and earning the name journeyman. In the 1850s, for example, Germans were a prominent part of the immigrant labor force in Detroit. The city had 23 small craft breweries, 15 of which were German and were kept running by skilled trade brewers. But as the work began to shift toward larger production lines and modern factory methods, employers began cutting corners by simplifying tasks and hiring cheaper, unskilled laborers instead. When it happened to the Detroit typesetters, they fought back. Mass literacy, the law of the land, had produced a more educated population, and as newspapers, periodicals, and books became big business, skilled typesetters were suddenly in great demand. The typesetters were part of a social group called the Detroit Typographical Society, which counted in its membership publishers of the city's newspapers and owners of small printing shops. In 1853, the publishers decided to replace their typesetters with untrained workers. The typesetters revolted, threw the publishers out of the society, and turned it into Detroit's first labor union, Local 18, a branch of the New York-based National Typographical Union. The carpenters, machinists, iron molders, and others soon followed, creating their own unions. By 1877, they had gained wide enough support that E.W. Simpson, president of the Carpenters Union, was elected to the Detroit City Council. Business owners across Michigan decried unions as a threat to the marketplace and to future profits.
When a company found out that someone was a union activist, they were dismissed, they were discharged. There was no rules or laws that said you had anything other than whatever the employer thought was fit in terms of that sort of thing.
In this atmosphere, the noble and holy order of the Knights of Labor emerged in Detroit and became the first statewide labor organization in Michigan. The Knights developed in secrecy under the name of the Washington Literary Society in order to protect its members. But when they did finally emerge under their real name, they revealed a labor movement made up of 70 unions and assemblies and with 13,000 members, a powerful new force. By the standards of the day, the Knights were very progressive. They called for unity and equality regardless of nationality, sex, or race, and their power was soon felt all over Michigan. A statewide lumber strike in Oscoda, Muskegon, and Saginaw closed down the industry and led to a new state law setting a 10-hour workday. Under the Knights, demands for better pay and working conditions spread to Michigan cities with strikes and work stoppages. Paper mills and a women's clothing company in Kalamazoo, furniture manufacturers in Grand Rapids, and the most contentious of all, a long mining strike in the Upper Peninsula around Calumet. By the time that the first automobiles came on the scene in 1899, rolling out of the Ransom Olds plant on Jefferson Avenue, Detroit had become a strong union town. But it was far from unified. A deep split separated skilled craftsmen from a mostly unskilled immigrant labor force. By 1910, the population of Detroit was 466,000, of which 345,000 were European immigrants and their children. The English-speaking and American-born or nativist craftsmen fought unskilled workers from Poland, Hungary, Austria, and Italy who were increasingly taking their jobs. The divisions ran so deep that unions often formed around ethnic roots, among them the Jewish Laundry Drivers Union and German Branch No. 2 of the Carpenters Union. Foreshadowing the immigration debates of today, some Detroit newspapers predicted that too many immigrants would destroy the United States. The patriotic American called on the U.S. Congress to, quote, close and seal our gates against the poverty of Europe. The craft unionists agreed. But economic downturns and an inability to keep pace with changes in modern factories proved to be too much for the Knights of Labor, and membership began to dwindle. Craft unions began to drift toward the Progressive American Federation of Labor, led by New York cigar makers Sam Gompers and Adolph Strasser. The AFL eventually replaced the Knights.
So you have a few unions among a few of these trades, but many of the employers, as technologies come in, as new work methods come in, as they start getting into scientific management, are using more and more the non-skilled, or really not non-skilled, but lesser skilled or differently skilled with the new kind of machinery. Which in some ways, when you come up to 100 years later today, we kind of have some remnants of the same story playing out, but in a little different way.
Massive industrialization forced out the Knights, but its growth in the Ford Motor Company, Cadillac, Packard, Oldsmobile, Chevrolet, and others sowed the seeds of a new kind of union, one that would unite workers of all skills rather than divide them. The rise of the United Auto Workers in 1935, along with the Congress of Industrial Unions, created labor powerhouses in Michigan.
Many of the trade union leaders that came out of the craft union tradition had a very narrow vision of what the labor movement was about, focused primarily on highly skilled workers who had considerable clout because of that skill, and tended to ignore workers that had not those skills, as well as, unfortunately, also ignoring women and people of color. And so within the labor movement, starting in the 20s, accelerating into the 30s, there was this huge internal debate, which led to a split and the creation of a new labor federation, the CIO, that essentially said we are taking a very different strategy in terms of this changing workforce. We are going to organize on an industrial basis, not on a craft basis. And we're going to organize all the workers in a plant into one big industrial union, whether it's the auto workers, rubber workers, steel workers, and so forth. And that turned out to be an extremely successful strategy.
Industrialization changed that equation in all sorts of ways, because in an auto factory, you're either a skilled trades worker, and you might have one of those titles like pipe fitter or whatever, but mostly likely you will be an assembler. You're defined by the fact that you work in a factory, not by your particular skill or whatever. And that was a new world, and the unions that existed in a different kind of economy, for all practical purposes, weren't appropriate and could not adapt to that world. And so new organizations were needed that reflected mass production in big factories, be they steel, rubber, auto assembly, etc., and that's what happened.